In an interview with a Russian war blogger made public this week, the head of Russia's mercenary Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, had this warning for the country's elite. Unless they gave up their charmed lives and pitched in on the war effort, the current moment in the country could end up looking like 1917. He was warning, in other words, of a second Russian revolution. It was just the latest of a series of alarming critiques that Prigozhin has lodged at the Russian establishment, including the current defense minister and even implicitly Putin himself. We know about Putin's complete unwillingness to brook any opposition, so why allow Prigozhin such open tirades, and what does it tell us about domestic politics in Russia at the moment in this war? Joining me now to talk about all this are Andrei Soldatov and Julia Ioffe. Andrei is a Russian investigative journalist living in exile, of course, in London. And Julia is a founding partner and Washington correspondent at Puck News. Julia, give us an overview of, just from what you can tell, are we overdoing it? Or, in all this reading of tea leaves, of looking at the fact that Putin doesn't discipline Prigozhin or the defense minister, or allows this all to happen, there's more going on underneath the surface than we think. What's your basic read?
Well, there is usually something more going on under the surface. And when you're looking at such a closed and opaque system, one in which journalists like Andrei have been kicked out unceremoniously or have been forced to leave, there's very little reporting on the ground. It's hard to tell what's going on, and it's important to know what's going on when Russia's waging this bloody criminal war in Ukraine and using people like Prigozhin to try to grind up the Ukrainian army, to take territory in the east. It's important to understand what's going on. And when you have not a lot of information, all you can do is read tea leaves and try to decipher the few public statements that these people make.
So Andrei, describe for us your answer to this question. What is going on? Because you have a wonderful foreign affairs essay where you make some very informed speculation.
Well, the problem with Prigozhin is that, of course, he is making all these attacks, and he's been attacking the military, and now it seems to be a next level. He's attacking the Russian elites and threatening their kids, and it seems to be completely out of line. But at the same time, I think that it's quite interesting that Putin is still, choose to tolerate Prigozhin, and I think this is because Putin doesn't have a real system of check and balances. So he needs, especially with this war, he needs to rely on some completely unorthodox methods to keep his people, the military generals and his elites, if not under control, but at least off balance. Prigozhin, who is happy to play a role of a weak jester, he is happy to provide Putin with this option. So he's attacking these people, sending a message that, look, you cannot be completely safe, and nobody has any guarantees in this new Russian system, which is Russia in 2023.
So, Julia, if this is the sort of world we're looking at in Russia, is Russia different from what we thought, or have things changed in this sense? I think we always thought Putin was very tightly in control, and the Russian state was a very tightly knit operation, that, he and his security elites, the FSB and such, were in complete control. The defense ministry and the army saluted. Does this suggest that it's not that much of a kind of vertical of power as we used to think?
Well, I think that Putin was very much in control, and the security services were very much in control. But as with anything in Russia, there are exceptions, and those exceptions are corruption, stupidity, malfeasance, stupidity. I mean, I even said that one twice. And it was not always, the tight ship that we imagined it to be over here in the West. I do think, though, to Andrei's point, that once Putin started the war and immediately didn't win it on his terms, as we know, he did not take Kiev in the first week. He did not have a victory parade in Kiev. He is still fighting for shreds of land in the east. And at this point, he needs anything he can throw at it. And Prigozhin does two things. First, he delivered the only kind of significant territorial win in the last few months. He delivered Bakhmut to Putin. It took him 7, 8, 9 months and tens of thousands of lives, but he did what the defense ministry run by the government could not do. And he also, to Andrei's point, he keeps the defense ministry in line. He keeps them kind of on their toes and trying to do better. He is the kind of junkyard dog that keeps the elites in line. The question is, what happens if the junkyard dog gets off his chain? He has a large army. He has other sources of income that aren't directly from Putin. All of his work in Africa and the Middle East have permitted him to take various mines, refineries, wells of gas and oil that give him a separate income stream. So he has, ironically, in a country where Putin was trying to eliminate any kind of dissent, any challenges of power, which he did from the liberal flank, he allowed a guy with an army to start criticizing him, which, people like Alexei Navalny, Boris Nemtsov never had.
Andrei, is there an early premonition of the fact that the Russian army and the security forces are not A, as united, and B, as loyal to Putin? In these reports that I've read, that Putin created his own presidential security force, which some people say, I think it was in 2016, the Duma creates this special security force, which its only job is to protect Putin. It only sits in Moscow. The Russian army is not allowed to enter Moscow. This feels like a Roman emperor creating his own Praetorian Guard. Does this mean that Putin doesn't trust the army?
Well, it's not that he doesn't trust the military. It's about his view of the world. And back in the KGB, he was taught to view the world in terms of threats. So every situation, and of course now he has a biggest crisis in his life, he's trying to look and to assess how risky it could be for him, politically speaking. And we are not talking about the battlefield. We are talking about political forces inside the country. Vladimir Putin was already prominent in the 1990s, and he remembers that even the disastrous Chechen war produced some very popular military generals who at some moment posed a very significant political threat to Putin's predecessor, Yeltsin. So Putin understands that. He wants to avoid it, and just in case, he wants to keep his military in line. He cannot tolerate a proper competition between his security services. So he cannot put his, say, National Guard against the army or the FSB against the SVR because it would be too risky for him. But to use someone like Prigozhin, who does have some independent income, but at the same time he doesn't have any political backing apart from the one provided by Putin himself. That seems to him, to Putin, as a really good idea. Well, it works for now. Let's see how it's gonna end.
Stay with us. When we come back, I'm going to ask both our guests where the Ukraine war goes next. Soldatov, a Russian investigative journalist based in London, and Julia Ioffe, the founding partner and Washington correspondent at Puck News. Julia, tell me, you're in Vilnius, you're attending a Future of Russia conference. What is your sense, and what is the general sense of what is going to happen next with this Ukrainian counteroffensive? It has been, it's been much telegraphed. Are the Ukrainians going to be able to take back the territory they lost in 2022?
I think, the offensive has become kind of a punchline, at least in Washington, in the sense that any question you ask any policymaker or anybody in the think tank or on the Hill, they'll say we have to wait till the Ukrainian counteroffensive Clearly, something has begun in terms of shaping operations, like the incursion into Belgorod, the small counteroffensives around Bakhmut, but we're still waiting for the main event. And I think it's anybody's guess. People are trying to be conservative and judicious in their predictions. People think that it will be much more difficult than the fall offensive when Ukraine won back Kharkiv and Kherson. But at this point, people in the West say, at Washington, at least in official Washington, that Ukraine has what it needs, and they're waiting to see what happens.
What's your gut?
My gut is that Ukraine overperforms as usual, but that it won't be quite enough to, for the Russian army to collapse and for them to fully win this war. I worry that Putin is willing to throw as much fodder at the meat grinder as he wants, and that he's waiting for the elections in the US for a DeSantis or a Trump to win in 2024, for Republicans to retake more power on the Hill, and that Western aid will dry up, and that he will just wait this out the way that Russians tend to win wars. They mess up in the beginning, they lose a lot of lives, but time or winter does the winning for them.
Andrei, what is your sense? One of the things you do hear often is, well, the Russians do have more resources. They do have, it's a much bigger country, much larger population. Putin can throw more troops into this meat grinder. What's your perspective when looking at it? And you think about this question of, are the Ukrainians going to do well? Are the Russians now so dug in? After all, they've been in parts of Donbass since 2014, so for over 10 years. Will the Ukrainians be able to push back?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We know that the Russian army build some fortifications to protect them from this counteroffensive, and we do know that, of course, Russia trained its troops, and it looks like they're in better shape than before. At the same time, what is absolutely clear that lots of people in Moscow, they're very nervous about this counteroffensive, and it looks like it's more than just about the counteroffensive. We need to remember that Putin made the point to avoid to start a new wave of mobilization, because he believes that this new wave of mobilization might actually create a very fragile situation for him politically in the country. And of course, it's absolutely clear that if, say, Ukrainian counteroffensive would be really, really successful, Putin would have no choice but to start this mobilization, and political risks for him would be absolutely different from what he has now.
Andrei, keep up your reporting, which has been absolutely fantastic. Julia, always a pleasure to hear your perspective. You always enlighten us. Thank you both. Next on GPS, global trade, innovation, and growth depend in large part on the world's second largest economy, China. But my next guest says we don't really understand China's economy, and she will explain it to us when we come back.